All right, folks. Dr. Hoplite is in. We're seeing patients today. Appreciate you coming back after a bit of a hiatus there. It's about a month since I've been gone. Life issues came up, such as they do. But we're back, and if you are here, you clicked on this video to see Superpowers, a Multipolar World Order. Right, so thanks again for being here. It's good to be back in front of the camera again. I was just going through some of the news articles that are out there today, and it looks like right now it's been almost 3 months of the Ukraine-Russian war. I mean, I know the Russians call it a military operation simply because they want to hold the word war for later, because they're going to say, if we wage war, then we're just going to let loose on Ukraine and you'll know the difference. Like, we get it. But the Ukrainian people right now, like, if you ask any one of them, they'll tell you it's war. Their country is being dismantled. And I'm looking at the news articles, and it's become more and more apparent that Ukraine is being used as a proxy against Russia. And the proxy war is being waged by the United States, principally the United States, and the European Union and the NATO alliance against Russia. And I still, for the life of me, don't know why the Western powers have decided to sacrifice Ukraine on account of this war, because that's what's going to happen. Ukraine is going to be dissected into, I think, territories or republics, and the traditional country of Ukraine will be reduced maybe to a quarter of its former size, and the remaining parts will be either Russian territory or perhaps Polish or Hungarian or Romanian, or kind of its own. Maybe Moldova will get bigger, who knows. But with what's going on right now in Ukraine, it shows no signs of slowing down, and the longer the Western powers keep this up with Russia, the more Ukraine and its people suffer. And when I first covered this topic with the Ukraine-Russian war, I opened it with the speech by Vladimir Putin that he gave on the eve of the invasion back in late February, and it was the Empire of Lies speech. And it was a very powerful speech. It's going to go down in history as one of the most significant speeches given by a world leader in decades. But I actually came across a YouTube video, and it came out of nowhere, like just in my random feed. And it was a speech that Vladimir Putin gave in February, ironically, he likes that month, of 2007. And it was the speech that he gave to the Munich Conference on security policy. And all the European leaders were there. At the time, Angela Merkel was a representative for Germany. Chancellor Merkel, I guess she was at the time. I don't know if the US had a representative there. I think it was mostly between the EU and Russia. But today I wanted to cover that speech. Looking back, through the rearview mirror, it's probably easy to see where all of this was going to come to a head, which is where we are here today. And how Vladimir Putin, for love him or hate him, but he was essentially telling the world, especially the European Union, what his plans were for the future of Russia, and how he was not going to go along with the program that they had in mind, which was a universal world order, as in there was going to be one way of doing things. Vladimir Putin saw things as a multipolar world order. And I think right now in 2022, we're seeing that this multipolar world order is going to eventually replace the universal Western model. But anyway, we look here at history and why this multipolar world order probably never truly went away. It just kind of went dormant. It kind of just fell asleep for a little bit. And the United States and NATO and the European Union got to do things their way. But because they did not take the threat, or at least the ability of Russia to reestablish itself seriously, this is why we are now looking at Russia ascending. And I think today news came out that the European Union is actually going to cave on the gas for rubles demand that Russia made. You know, when it first happened in I think it was March, where the Russian Federation said to Gazprom Bank, you're going to close accounts with all unfriendly nations, which would have been EU nations, the US and NATO, and you're going to sell them Russian gas on two conditions: that they open an account with you and that they pay you in rubles or at the very least gold. And of course the Europeans turned up their nose at the Russians and said, we're not going to do that. No way. And Russia said, yeah, you will. And Europeans said, no, we won't. And the Russians said, yeah, you will. And the Europeans said, well, no, we won't. And today the Europeans are saying, okay, yeah, we will. So they're caving on this, and they had to. And everybody saw that coming as well, because this is what it's come to in the currency war, is Russia has backed the horse of commodities. And the world, you know, for all of its innovation and wealth, needs commodities. It needs raw materials, it needs gas, it needs oil, it needs natural gas, it needs things like palladium, like platinum, like iron ore, all that stuff. That is necessary for any nation that's building things or trying to maintain what it has. And Russia knew this. And the European Union and the United States did not take them seriously. And we're going to read the speech now from 2007, where they were given a good notice as to what was coming, and they just did not heed it. But as we see, the USSR lasted between 1922 and 1991. That's a long time, but not really long in the grand scheme of nation states. And the United States became a world power in conjunction with the Soviet Union in 1945. Who knows how long that will last? The United States, with the European allies, formed the North Atlantic Trade Organization. And the Treaty Organization for the Trade was established in 1949. Who knows how long that's going to last? The Russian Federation was established from the ashes of the Soviet Union, and it began in 1991. And who knows how long that will last? But this is the new multipolar world order, and there's no denying now that Russia is going to be a part of that world order. China will be part of that world order as well, and that'll be a video for a different day, but today we're talking about Russia because of the ongoing war in Ukraine. Okay, so let's rewind the clock. We're going back to February 10th, 2007, Munich, Germany, and Vladimir Putin, as the president of Russia, is going to address the conference. I'll put the go-bys here so you can follow me, as always, and I'll break in between a couple of pages because he goes on for a bit now. You know, you've got Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and then you've got Putin, right? When these Russians don't want to talk, they don't talk. But then when they do want to talk, they'll go on for like 50 years. So this is one of those events where Vladimir Putin was waiting to give this speech, and he took the stage, and here we go. All right. And President Putin began. Thank you very much, dear Madam Federal Chancellor, Mr. Telchik, ladies and gentlemen. I am truly grateful to be invited to such a representative conference that has assembled politicians, military officials, entrepreneurs, and experts from more than 40 nations. This conference's structure allows me to avoid excessive politeness and the need to speak in roundabout pleasant but empty diplomatic terms. This conference's format will allow me to say what I really think about international security problems. And if my comments seem unduly polemic, pointed or inexact to our colleagues, then I would ask you not to get angry with me. After all, this is only a conference. And I hope that after the first 2 or 3 minutes of my speech, Mr. Telchik will not turn on the red light over there. Okay, so right out of the gate, Vlad is setting up the pins. He's like, I'm not going to pull punches. I'm going to say what I want to say. You could tell that the Russian people, and in particular the Russian government and Vladimir Putin, were waiting for this moment. And it seemed like they saw the time was getting ripe for them to make a move on the world stage. And he's already saying from the get-go, hey, I'm not gonna BS you. I'm gonna shoot you straight. So here it comes, get ready. He continues, therefore, it is well known that international security compromises much more than issues relating to military and political stability. It involves the stability of the global economy, overcoming poverty, economic security, and developing a dialogue between civilizations. Okay, I'll stop right there again because I'm still on the first page of this speech and he is just firing on all cylinders saying We're here to talk about international security, but that's much more than just military matters. We're talking about the global economy, poverty in the world, over economic security as a whole, and developing dialogue between civilizations. He's not talking about nations. He's not even talking about organizations. He's talking about civilizations, right? The superpower civilizations between the USSR, the USA, the NATO, those were more along country lines. But I almost want to say he was reading Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations before writing this speech, because in the first page, he prefaces everything as a dialogue between civilizations, and that security issues go far beyond military concerns. We're talking about the global economy. And right now in 2022, we're dealing with a currency war between the United States, Russia, and the European Union. We have the West and the East in a currency war, and it's getting very bad. And we knew this was going to get bad, but we haven't seen anything yet. Inflation might seem like it's pretty awful right now, but wait a year, right? I just filled up my tank today, and it was just under $5. And I don't live in an extremely populated part of America, but a pretty highly populated part. But I know for a fact when I go back to that gas station in about a month, it'll be over $5 and probably 25 cents, without a doubt. Food prices are going up, food shortages. This is what he's talking about in 2007, right? This is about 15 years ago, and he was already telling us the civilizational wars will be much more than military conflicts. They'll be global, and they'll deal mostly with economics. Okay, let's continue. President Putin continued, this universal, indivisible character of security is expressed as the basic principle that security for one is security for all. As Franklin D. Roosevelt said during the first few days that the Second World War was breaking out, when peace has been broken anywhere, the peace of all countries everywhere is in danger. These words remain topical today. Incidentally, the theme of our conference, Global Crises, Global Responsibility, exemplifies this. Only 2 decades ago, the world was ideologically and economically divided, and it was the huge strategic potential of 2 superpowers that ensured global security. Okay, so again, he's making reference to the USSR and the USA as the 2 main superpowers of the world. And because the United States and Russia more or less shared stewardship over the world as the 2 superpowers, there was relative peace. I mean, it was a Cold War, and we know it wasn't easy going, but if you look back at the Cold War, it was a time of relative worldwide peace. We did not have things like World War II or World War I happening because you had 2 nuclear powers that were in charge of their individual spheres, East and West, and they knew where the lines were drawn, and the 2 superpowers knew where that line was, and they did not try to cross it. Or they worked very hard to keep up relations with each other so that if incursions were made, that there could be some sort of peaceful negotiation to bring things back to stasis. Okay, continuing. This global standoff pushed the sharpest economic and social problems to the margins of the international communities and the world's agenda. And just like any war, the Cold War left us with live ammunition, figuratively speaking. I am referring to ideological stereotypes, double standards, and other typical aspects of Cold War bloc thinking. The unipolar world that had been proposed after the Cold War did not take place either. The history of humanity certainly has gone through unipolar periods and seen aspirations to world supremacy, and what hasn't happened in world history. However, what is a unipolar world? However one might embellish this term, at the end of the day it refers to one type of situation, namely one center of authority, one center of force, one center of decision-making. It is a world in which there is one master, one sovereign, and at the end of the day this is pernicious not only for all those within the system, but also for the sovereign itself, because it destroys itself from within. And this certainly has nothing in common with democracy, because as you know, democracy is the power of the majority in light of the interests and opinions of the minority. Incidentally, Russia, we are constantly being taught about democracy, but for some reason, those who teach us do not want to learn themselves. Okay, that quote right there, I've heard that quote before, and it's It's one of Putin's best. In a sense, he's telling the West, especially the United States, what is a unipolar world? Well, it's dictatorial rule, right? It's one sovereign, one decision maker, one policy. And in that world, everybody else who disagrees is kept under tyrannical rule. As in, if you don't agree with the way things are, what are you going to do about it? And that doesn't sound very democratic, does it? But the United States prides itself as the shining beacon on the hill where people can live as free as they choose to live within the confines of law. And what is the law in the United States? Well, it's democratic rule. We elect representatives, they write laws or repeal laws based upon the people's wishes. But on the grand stage in the world, unipolar rule through the United States' lens of how the world should run doesn't sound very democratic. So it's a bit of a oxymoron, right? The United States holds itself out as the greatest democracy mankind has experimented with, yet on the world stage, the United States rules with an iron fist, and it's our way or the highway. That's what he's saying. Okay, moving on. I consider that the unipolar model is not only unacceptable, but also impossible in today's world. And this is not only because if there was individual leadership in today's and precisely in today's world, then the military, political, and economic resources would not suffice. What is even more important is that the model itself is flawed because at its basis, there is and can be no moral foundation for modern civilization. Along with this, what is happening in today's world, and we just started to discuss this, is a tentative to introduce precisely this concept in international affairs, the concept of a unipolar world, and with which results. Unilateral and frequently illegitimate actions have not resolved any problems. Moreover, they have caused new human tragedies and created new centers of tension. Judge for yourselves. Wars as well as local and regional conflicts have not diminished. Mr. Telchik mentioned this very gently. And no less people perish in these conflicts. Even more are dying than before. Significantly more. Significantly more. Today we are witnessing an almost uncontained hyperuse of force, military force, in international relations. Force that is plunging the world into an abyss of permanent conflicts. As a result, we do not have sufficient strength to find a comprehensive solution to any one of these conflicts. Finding a political settlement also becomes impossible. We are seeing a greater and greater disdain for the basic principles of international law, and the independent legal norms are, as a matter of fact, coming increasingly closer to one state's legal system. One state, and of course, first and foremost, the United States, has overstepped its national borders in every way. This is visible in the economic, political, cultural, and educational policies it imposes on other nations. Well, who likes this? Who is happy about this? In international relations, we increasingly see the desire to resolve a given question according to the so-called issues of political expediency based on the current political climate. And of course, this is extremely dangerous. It results in the fact that no one feels safe. I want to emphasize this. No one feels safe because no one can feel that international law is like a stone wall that will protect them. Of course, such a policy stimulates an arms race. Okay, so he's firing shots over the United States' bow right here saying, listen, we live under this unipolar world and we have since 1991. And what has happened? You still have war. You still have people who have regional, local, ethnic conflicts. But the United States, because it is this unipolar authority, decides to stick its nose into every little thing, into every little corner of the world. And what happens? Nobody's happy, nobody feels safe. Because they believe that if they decide to exercise even the slightest bit of sovereignty, the United States and Uncle Sam's big green army is going to come and put a boot in their ass. And then what's going to happen? They're going to just wreck the place, they're going to leave, and we're still going to have the same problems we had, except now everything that was over 2 stories is now a pile of rubble. And he's saying that the United States, because of this political climate it has created, has by its own volition created a state of international instability through which, as he said, no one feels safe. All right, continuing. The force's dominance inevitably encourages a number of countries to acquire weapons of mass destruction. Moreover, significantly new threats, though they were also well known before, have appeared. And today threats such as terrorism have taken on global character. I am convinced that we have reached that decisive moment when we must seriously think about the architecture of global security. And we must proceed by searching for a reasonable balance between the interests of all participants in the international dialogue, especially since the international landscape is so varied and changes so quickly. Changes in light of the dynamic development in a whole number of countries and regions. Madam Federal Chancellor already mentioned this. This combined GDP measured in purchasing power parities of countries such as India and China is already greater than that of the United States, and a similar calculation with the GDP of the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, surpasses the cumulative GDP of the EU. And according to experts, this gap will only increase in the future. Okay, Vlad is throwing haymakers now. He is firing shots over the United States' bow, over Germany's bow. He's mentioning, Federal Madam Chancellor, High Supreme, Priestess Merkel, and he's talking about the BRICS nations. And right now, it's May 2022, and the foundation of diplomacy and friendship that the Russians were fostering with countries like India, China, South Africa, and Brazil, those relationships now are what they will rely upon, and those are starting to bear fruit. You see that India is not breaking ranks with Russia. You see that China is keeping quiet because it has its own motives and it has its own agenda, but it's not going to turn its back on Russia. They're literally side by side, and they rely upon each other for large portions of their economy. So what you have are the BRICS nations that are going to represent Eastern civilization, and the United States and the EU that are going to represent Western civilization. But he's telling these countries, we're not going along with this unipolar world anymore. Me and my buddies, India, China, Brazil, and South Africa, we got our own thing going on, and we think that our GDP and our purchasing power is closing the gap on your purchasing power and your GDP, and we think that's only going to continue into the future. He's saying this in 2007, so he saw the writing on the wall way back when, and he said maybe in 10, 15 years or less, we'll be right up there with the EU, and we'll have the same purchasing power as the United States, its allies, and who's going to mess with us then? This is what he's saying. He's telling them. These people are sitting right in front of him, not even 10 yards away, looking up as he's saying this speech to them, to their faces. And we can tell, they didn't take him seriously. He was telling them, here's what I intend to do, and here's what we're not going to go along with anymore. And I don't know if anybody in that room actually said, to Merkel or whoever said, I think we should talk about this. The Russians aren't playing around. It's not 1991 anymore. It's 2007, and he's already seeing the future. I mean, we got to get our act together, or we at least have to bring Russia to the table and start, bargaining. But we didn't. We kept pushing this. Okay, moving on. President Putin continues. There is no reason to doubt that the economic potential of the new centers of global economic growth will inevitably be converted into political influence and will strengthen multipolarity. In connection with this, the role of multilateral diplomacy is significantly increasing. The need for principles such as openness, transparency, and predictability in politics is uncontested, and the use of force should be a really exceptional measure, comparable to using the death penalty in the judicial systems of certain states. However, today we are witnessing the opposite tendency, namely a situation in which countries that forbid the death penalty, even for murderers and other dangerous criminals, are airily participating in military operations that are difficult to consider legitimate. And as a matter of fact, these conflicts are killing people, hundreds and thousands of civilians. Okay, Putin's turning his guns right back over to the United States and firing more shots over the bow. He's talking about the war on terror right now. This is 2007, and the war on terror is in full swing. George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and Rumsfeld and Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice and all that crew, they're telling us Saddam's got weapons of mass destruction. I covered that in my episode on false flags when Colin Powell held up the little vial of fake anthrax. Yeah, we know that was bull crap. But he's talking about this tendency of a unilateral, unipolar world giving the one decision maker all the incentive to insist upon inserting itself into skirmishes or disagreements or fights somewhere in the world that it has no place in being. And it's killing hundreds of thousands of people. And these these wars that are being waged by the United States, the war on terror, are illegitimate, right? We justified the war on terror because of 9/11 and we got to get even with bin Laden, even though he was nowhere near Afghanistan or Iraq. He was hanging out in Pakistan for God knows how many years. But we just destroyed these two nations for almost 2 decades. And for what? Well, because it was our way or the highway. We wanted to get even with who hit us, but we didn't really know exactly how to go about it. So we just picked 2 nation states that we thought we would have the most effect in. And we decided, yeah, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, those 2. And Putin is saying right here that this is like a country exercising the death penalty for any little infraction, despite the fact that in that same country, it still decides to put people in jail for their life versus killing them for their crimes because they're more humane. Again, he's saying the hypocrisy of the West, United States, where they won't put people to death for being murderers, but they'll go and wage war in some far-flung part of the globe in the sandbox and kill hundreds of thousands of people there and call it a win. He's getting very personal here. And I have to imagine there has to be a United States delegate in the audience, if not George W. Bush, somebody high up enough that this is starting to resonate. Okay, continuing. Vladimir Putin continues. But at the same time, the question arises of whether we should be indifferent and aloof to various internal conflicts inside the countries, to authoritarian regimes, to tyrants, and to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. As a matter of fact, this was also at the center of the question that our dear colleague, Mr. Lieberman, asked the federal chancellor. If I correctly understood your question addressing Mr. Lieberman, then of course it is a serious one. Can we be indifferent observers in view of what is happening? I will try to answer your question as well. Of course not. But do we have the means to counter these threats? Certainly we do. It is sufficient to look at recent history. Did not our country have a peaceful transition to democracy? Indeed, we witnessed a peaceful transformation of the Soviet regime. A peaceful transformation. And what a regime! With what a number of weapons, including nuclear weapons. Why should we start bombing and shooting now at every available opportunity? Is it the case when without the threat of mutual destruction, we do not have enough political culture, respect for democratic values, and for the law? Okay, now he's asking, I think it was Joe Lieberman at the time, okay, so now we don't have the bipolar superpower world of the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviet Union is gone. We transitioned to a democracy. You don't see us shooting and bombing our way into becoming this again. We're democratic. Allegedly, so are you, the United States. So is it really that bad, and is human nature that evil, that unless we have mutually assured destruction, is peace in a multipolar world possible? He's saying it is possible, but has the United States really given it a chance, right? That sounds like very hippy-dippy, John Lennon to give peace a chance. But now that we have 2 democratic states, the United States is clearly the more powerful country after the fall of the Soviet Union. So we have 2 democracies. Do we really need nuclear weapons to hold both parties in check, or can we do it through more peaceful policies, through more diplomacy? He's asking this question. He believes they can. Continuing. I am convinced that the only mechanism that can make decisions about using military force as a last resort is the Charter of the United Nations. And in connection with this, either I did not understand what our colleague, the Italian defense minister, just said, or what he said was inexact. In any case, I understood that the use of force can only be legitimate when the decision is taken by NATO, the EU, or the UN. If he really does think so, then we have different points of view, or I didn't hear him correctly. The use of force can only be considered legitimate if the decision is sanctioned by the UN, and we do not need to substitute NATO or the EU for the UN. When the UN will truly unite the forces of the international community and can really react to events in various countries, when we will leave behind this disdain for international law, then the situation will be able to change. Otherwise, the situation will simply result in a dead end, and the number of serious mistakes will be multiplied. Along with this, it is necessary to make sure that international law have a universal character both in conception and applications of its norms. And one must not forget that democratic political actions necessarily go along with discussion and a laborious decision-making process. Okay, so now he's appealing to the United Nations as the sole arbiter of what should dictate uses of force in a multipolar world where you have the US, NATO, and the Russian Federation. It shouldn't be up to Russia. It shouldn't be up to the EU. It shouldn't be up to the US. It shouldn't be up to NATO. It should be up to the United Nations, where all nations of the world that are participants come together and the diplomatic process is worked out between countries, and it comes to more or less a democratic vote among the countries as to who is in the wrong and if force is justified. So he's appealing to the democratic process. But he is saying that he gets the feeling that he's the only one who thinks this is legitimate, and that the rest of the European nations think that the NATO alliance or the EU is just as viable as the UN would be. Of course, as the Russian Federation president, he would disagree with this completely. Okay. He continues, "Dear ladies and gentlemen, the potential danger of the destabilization of international relations is connected with obvious stagnation in the disarmament issue. Russia supports the renewal of dialogue on this important question. It is important to conserve the international legal framework relating to weapons destruction and therefore ensure continuity in the process of reducing nuclear weapons. Together with the United States of America, we agreed to reduce our nuclear strategic missile capabilities to up to 1,700 to 2,000 nuclear warheads by December 31st, 2012. Russia intends to strictly fulfill the obligations it has taken on. We hope that our partners will also act in a transparent way and will refrain from laying aside a couple of hundred superfluous nuclear warheads for a rainy day. And if today the new American defense minister declares that the United States will not hide these superfluous weapons in a warehouse, or as one might say, under a pillow or under the blanket, then I suggest that we all rise and greet this declaration standing. It would be a very important declaration." Okay, so Putin still remembers the days where the Soviet Union was being strong-armed by the United States and the rest of the world to further deplete and reduce its nuclear arsenal. The United States was taking steps to at least show a little good faith and engage in nuclear disarmament as well. But we all know that, what they write on paper and what they put out publicly on the news ain't the truth, right? If the Russian Federation says, oh yeah, we only have about 300 nuclear warheads, they probably have something like 900. If the United States has, we only have 1,000, we probably have something like 3,000, right? But the idea is to keep people talking about reduction so that the person who uses nuclear force first will always appear as the aggressor. Because if both parties are talking about disarmament and finding peaceful ways to resolve their conflicts, then obviously the person who first uses a nuclear strike will have considered violating the agreement, and the international community should come out in arms against them and them alone. That's the idea, right? We might not be reducing things like we say, but as long as we're reducing our arms somewhat, maybe someday we'll get to the point where we can't kill each other with nuclear weapons. Who knows if we'll ever get there, but it's worth considering. Okay, moving on. Russia strictly adheres to and intends to further adhere to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, as well as the Multilateral Supervision Regime for Missile Technologies. The principles incorporated in these documents are universal ones. In connection with this, I would like to recall that in the 1980s, the USSR and the United States signed an agreement to destroy a whole range of small and medium-range missiles, but these documents do not have a universal character. Today, many other countries have these missiles, including the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the Republic of Korea, India, Iran, Pakistan, and Israel. Many countries are working on these systems and plan to incorporate them as part of their weapons arsenals. And only the United States and Russia bear the responsibility to not create such weapon systems. It is obvious that in these conditions, we must think about ensuring our own security. At the same time, it is impossible to sanction the appearance of new, destabilizing high-tech weapons. Needless to say, it refers to measures to prevent a new area of confrontation, especially outer space. Star Wars is no longer a fantasy, it is a reality. In the middle of the 1980s, our American partners were already able to intercept their own satellite. Okay, so when Donald Trump was president, a lot of people laughed when he came up with the idea of Space Force, right? Because it was a very Trump name for, we'll call it Space Force, not Space Marines, not the the Astro Guard or something like that. It was Space Force, like Spaceballs. If you've seen that, anyway. But this was prescient, right? Vladimir Putin is talking about this in 2007, that Reagan's program that he helped spearhead in the 80s, Star Wars, was laughed at in its day and age as well. Well, fast forward to 2022, Elon Musk has something like, I don't know how many satellites in orbit, the Starlink system. Elon Musk is also a private citizen, but he's sending people into orbit. The space race is still on, and warfare will not be excluded from this race. So everyone laughed at Star Wars with Reagan. Everybody laughed at Trump for Space Force. But I'll tell you what, it's 2022 and Space Force still exists. And it's going to get bigger as time goes on, you can guarantee that. And the Russians, I'm sure, are working on something very similar. This is what he's saying, is that we have to consider security beyond our own borders. We have to consider that other countries are developing nuclear arsenals, and that we have a responsibility as these two former superpowers, still world powers, that a lot of this is going to be on us to make sure that conflict, the likes of World War II, doesn't rear its ugly head again, because we have no excuses now. We have no excuses because we lived that history and we remember it. The Russians especially remember it. Continuing. In Russia's opinion, the militarization of outer space could have unpredictable consequences for the international community and provoke nothing less than the beginning of a nuclear era. We have come forward more than once with initiatives designed to prevent the use of weapons in outer space. Today, I would like to tell you that we have prepared a project for an agreement on the prevention of deploying weapons in outer space. In the near future, it will be sent to our partners as an official proposal. Let's work on this together. Plans to expand certain elements of the anti-missile defense system to Europe cannot help but disturb us. Who needs the next step of what would be, in this case, an inevitable arms race? I deeply doubt that Europeans themselves do. Missile weapons with a range of about 5,000 to 8,000 kilometers that really pose a threat to Europe do not exist in any of the so-called problem countries. And in the near future and prospects, this will not happen and is not even foreseeable. Any hypothetical launch, for example, a North Korean rocket to American territory through Western Europe, obviously contradicts the laws of ballistics. As we say in Russia, it would be like using the right hand to reach the left ear. And here in Germany, I cannot help but mention the pitiable condition of the Treaty of Conventional Armed Forces in Europe. The Adapted Treaty on the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe was signed in 1999. It took into account a new geopolitical reality, namely the elimination of the Warsaw Bloc. 7 years have passed and only 4 states have ratified this document, including the Russian Federation. Okay, so now the speech is getting a bit more real, because he's foreshadowing what he sees on the horizon, and it is this conflict that is going to be inevitable should the borders of NATO reach further and further towards the borders of the Russian Federation. And there were these treaties in place, the Adapted Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe in 1999. Russia signed it, but when the Warsaw Bloc ended, this was supposed to take its place. And it seems like only Russia was still at the table waiting for people to come and sign it as they had agreed. So he is saying that for these missile defense systems to be moving closer and closer to Russia for Europe's or for America's own defense from these rogue states is not accurate. He knows they're moving these missile defense systems closer to Russia because it's closer to Russia. And he's saying that this is disturbing the Russian Federation, as it would have disturbed us, as it did in the Bay of Pigs. This is his concern, and this is 2007, and he's telling these people, the European Union and the United States sitting in the audience, I have a problem with this. We should work this out. He continues. NATO countries openly declared that they will not ratify this treaty, including the provisions on flank restrictions, on deploying a certain number of armed forces in flank zones, until Russia removed its military bases from Georgia and Moldova. Our army is leaving Georgia, even according to an accelerated schedule. We resolved the problems we had with our Georgian colleagues, as everyone knows. There are still 1,500 servicemen in Moldova that are carrying out peacekeeping operations and protecting warehouses with ammunition left over from Soviet times. We constantly discuss this issue with Mr. Solana, and he knows our position. We are ready to further work in this direction. But what is happening at the same time? Simultaneously, the so-called flexible frontline American bases with up to 5,000 men in each. It turns out that NATO has put its frontline forces on our borders, and we continue to strictly fulfill the treaty obligations and do not react to these actions at all. Okay, again, he's telling NATO, listen, we had our issue with Georgia. We worked it out. We shook hands. We're friends over it. We're doing peacekeeping operations in Moldova. We're withdrawing from Georgia. But we see what's going on with these NATO countries. These NATO countries are moving 5,000 men at a time, in some cases, closer and closer to our border. We're fulfilling our obligations via treaty, and we're not reacting to what we perceive as hostile movement by NATO forces along our border. Again, he's looking into the crowd and he's telling people, Russia's not okay with this. And you wouldn't be okay with this either if it was us doing this to you. If it was Russia moving bases closer and closer to NATO borders, you would be calling us on a regular basis, asking us, what is this all about? Do you intend to attack? Are you daring us to mobilize NATO forces against you? That's what would happen. And he's pointing this fact out. Carrying on, he says, I think it is obvious that NATO expansion does not have any relation with the modernization of the alliance itself or with ensuring security in Europe. On the contrary, it represents a serious provocation that reduces the level of mutual trust. And we have the right to ask, against whom is this expansion intended? And what happened to the assurances our Western partners made after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact? Where are those declarations today? No one even remembers them, but I will allow myself to remind this audience what was said. I would like to quote the speech of NATO General Secretary Mr. Werner in Brussels on May 17, 1990. He said at the time, the fact that we are ready not to place a NATO army outside of German territory gives the Soviet Union a firm security guarantee. Where are these guarantees? The stones and concrete blocks of the Berlin Wall have long been distributed as souvenirs. But we should not forget that the fall of the Berlin Wall was possible thanks to a historic choice, one that was made also by our people, the people of Russia, a choice in favor of democracy, freedom, openness, and a sincere partnership with all the members of the big European family. And now that we are trying to impose new dividing lines and walls on us, these walls may be virtual, but they are nevertheless dividing, ones that cut through our continent. And it is possible that we will once again require many years and decades, as well as several generations of politicians, to disassemble and dismantle these new walls. Dear ladies and gentlemen, we are unequivocally in favor of strengthening the regime of non-proliferation. The present international legal principles allow us to develop technologies to manufacture nuclear fuel for peaceful purposes. And many countries, with all good reasons, want to create their own nuclear energy as a basis for their energy independence. But we also understand that these technologies can be quickly transformed into nuclear weapons. This creates serious international tensions. The situation surrounding the Iranian nuclear program acts as a clear example. And if the international community does not find a reasonable solution for resolving this conflict of interest, the world will continue to suffer similar destabilizing crises because there are more threshold countries than simply Iran. We both know this. We're going to constantly fight against the threat of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Last year, Russia put forward the initiative to establish international centers for the enrichment of uranium. We are open to the possibility that such centers not only be created in Russia, but also in other countries where there is a legitimate basis for using civil nuclear energy. Countries that want to develop their nuclear energy could guarantee that they will receive fuel through direct participation in these centers. And the centers would, of course, operate under strict IAEA supervision. The latest initiatives put forward by American President George W. Bush are in conformity with the Russian proposals. I consider that Russia and the USA are objectively and equally interested in strengthening the regime of non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and their deployment. It is precisely our countries with leading nuclear and missile capabilities that must act as leaders in developing new, stricter non-proliferation measures. Russia is ready for such work. We are engaged in consultations with our American friends. In general, we should talk about establishing a whole system of political incentives and economic stimuli whereby it would not be in states' interest to establish their own capabilities in the nuclear fuel cycle, but they would still have the opportunity to develop nuclear energy and strengthen their energy capabilities. In connection with this, I shall talk about the international energy cooperation in more detail. Madam Federal Chancellor also spoke about this briefly. She touched on this theme. In the energy sector, Russia intends to create uniform market principles and transparent conditions for all. It is obvious that energy prices must be determined by the market instead of being the subject of political speculation, economic pressure, or blackmail. We are open to cooperation. Foreign companies participate in all our major energy projects. According to different estimates, up to 26% of the oil extraction in Russia and please think about this figure, up to 6% of the oil extraction in Russia is done by foreign capital. Try to find me a similar example where Russian business participates extensively in key economic sectors in Western countries. Such examples do not exist. There are no such examples. I would also recall the parity of foreign investments in Russia and that Russia makes abroad. The parity is about 15-1, and here you have an obvious example of the openness and stability of the Russian economy. Okay, he's dovetailing back into economics here, and he's talking about economic stability. He's talking about the openness of the Russian people and its economy to the world, and the incentives that Russia wants to create for all the nations of the world that want to pursue nuclear energy to do it through essentially UN-chartered nuclear centers, whether they be in Russia or Europe or USA or wherever. But that all nations of the world would participate in these nuclear centers so that there would be effective checks and balances to make sure it's being used for energy, it's being used safely, and it's not being weaponized. But here he's making a very salient point, especially in this year, that he says 26% of the oil extraction in Russia is done by foreign capital, right? That is coming back to bite Europe in a very bad way. Because once Russia decides that it no longer continues to regard that foreign capital as friendly, they say no more, they turn off the tap, and poof, like that, 26% of the oil extraction in Russia stays in Russia, which means they can use that energy for their purposes, or they can sell it to the more friendly nations, the BRICS nations. And he called the bluff of the European Union, right? He said, okay, we're at war with Ukraine. You're trying to wage a proxy war with us. We're going to turn off the tap. And if you want our oil, if you want our natural gas, you're going to pay us in our currency or with gold. And the Europeans said, no way. 3 months later, now they're saying, okay, we give. So he knew what was going on in the world markets, in the world economy, and he knew that the Russian Federation, being this massive country, the largest country in the world by landmass, had this ability, and he's exercising it. So he was making note of this to the crowd, and if anybody was taking notes, as he was saying, they should have put two and two together, said Russia has a boatload of commodities, and if they decide one day to tank the world markets by refusing to permit purchase of those commodities, our economies could also go under. And here we are. All right, continuing. President Putin says, economic security is the sector in which all must adhere to uniform principles. We are ready to compete fairly. For that reason, more and more opportunities are appearing in the Russian economy. Experts and our Western partners are objectively evaluating these changes. As such, Russia's OECD sovereign credit rating improved, and Russia passed from the 4th to the 3rd group. And today in Munich, I would like to use this occasion to thank our German colleagues for their help in the above decision. Furthermore, as you know, the process of Russia joining the World Trade Organization has reached its final stages. I would put out that during long, difficult talks, we heard words about freedom of speech, free trade, equal possibilities more than once, but for some reason exclusively in reference to the Russian market. And there is still one more important theme that directly affects global security. Today, many talk about the struggle against poverty. What is actually happening in this sphere? On the one hand, financial resources are allocated for programs to help the world's poorest countries, and at times, substantial financial resources. But to be honest, and many here also know this, linked with the development of some donor countries' companies. And on the other hand, developed countries simultaneously keep their agricultural subsidies and limit some countries' access to high-tech products. And let's say things as they are. One hand distributes charitable help, and the other hand not only preserves economic backwardness, but also reaps the profits thereof. The increasing social tension in depressed regions inevitably results in the growth of radicalism, extremism, feeds terrorism, and local conflicts. And if all this happens in, shall we say, a region such as the Middle East, where there is increasingly the sense that the world at large is unfair, then there is a risk of global destabilization. It is obvious that the world's leading countries should see this threat, and that they should therefore build a more democratic, fair system of global economic relations, a system that would give everyone the chance and the possibility to develop. Dear ladies and gentlemen, speaking at the Conference on Security Policy, it is impossible not to mention the activities of the Organization for the Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. As is well known, this organization was created to examine all, I shall emphasize this, all aspects of security, military, political, economic, humanitarian, and especially the relations between these spheres. What do we see happening today? We see that this balance is clearly destroyed. People are trying to transform the OSCE into a vulgar instrument designed to promote the foreign policy interests of one or a group of countries. And this task is also being accomplished by the OSCE's bureaucratic apparatus, which is absolutely not connected with the state founders in any way. Decision-making procedures and the involvement of so-called non-governmental organizations are tailored for this task. These organizations are formally independent, but they are purposefully financed and therefore under control. Okay, I'm starting to stumble over these words because he's just going and going and going, but he's talking about the global stability of the world relying upon not just the military, but economics, of food, of poverty. It's something that encompasses every sphere and activity that mankind engages in. Global security relies upon cooperation among the world powers to look to all of these different things. And what he's saying is that he believes that Russia is being given the shaft on a lot of these tasks. So he's calling upon the European Union and the United States and other countries to kind of meet Russia in the middle, right? If we're going to abide by these treaties, if we're not going to proliferate nuclear weapons, if we're going to help the world become energy independent, if we're going to let the world come into Russia and do business with Russian banks, do business with Russian commodities firms, then you got to meet us halfway. You got to meet us on the non-proliferation. You got to pull back NATO. You got to let Russian businesses take advantage of European and Western markets. And right now, Russia doesn't get the feeling that this is happening. And they're starting to get perturbed by it, is what he's getting down to. Okay, continuing. Putin continues. According to the founding documents, in the humanitarian sphere, the OSCE is designed to assist country members in observing international human rights norms at their request. This is an important task. We support this, but this does not mean interfering in the internal affairs of other countries, and especially not imposing a regime that determines how these states should live and develop. It is obvious that such interference does not promote the development of democratic states at all. On the contrary, it makes them dependent and, as a consequence, politically and economically unstable. We expect that the OSCE be guided by its primary tasks and build relations with sovereign states based on respect, trust, and transparency. Dear ladies and gentlemen, he said that 3 times. In conclusion, I would like to note the following. We very often, and personally I very often, hear appeals by our partners, including our European partners, to the effect that Russia should play an increasingly active role in world affairs. In connection with this, I would allow myself to make one small remark. It is hardly necessary to incite us to do so. Russia is a country with a history that spans more than 1,000 years and has practically always used the privilege to carry out an independent foreign policy. We are not going to change this tradition today. At the same time, we are well aware of how the world has changed, and we have a realistic sense of our own opportunities and potential. And of course, we would like to interact with responsible and independent partners with whom we could work together in constructing a fair and democratic world order that would ensure security and prosperity not only for a select few, but for all. Thank you for your attention. Okay, whoa. Wow, yeah. Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Putin, like I said. So when Russians are quiet, they're quiet. They don't talk. They're very stoic, but when they go, they just go and go. So that was Vladimir Putin, February 10th, 2007, to the Munich Conference on Security Policy. And he was telling the world, listen, we're not going back to being the Soviet Union. That's been tried, that failed. It was evil. He won't say that, but it was a failed attempt at a very tyrannical rule of government. But now we find ourselves a new democracy post-1991 living in a world where there is unipolar rule. The USA, the NATO countries, the European Union, they are calling the shots. It's mostly the United States, but of course the European powers are there with them. And we don't think this is fair. We don't think this is democratic. So we would like a little bit more effort on your part to, as I said before, meet us in the middle. I don't think anybody at this conference, anybody of any significance, took Vladimir Putin seriously, because everybody in that conference was a product of the Cold War. As far as they saw it, their parents fought World War II. They won World War II. The United States and the European powers of the West beat the Soviet Union. They lost that war. Post 1991, they consider Russia a, I guess you would say, a neutered version of the Soviet Union. Something they don't respect, something they don't have to take seriously. Putin was saying to them, no, you do have to take us seriously. We're not going back to this, but we're not going away either. So unless you come to the table and deal with us, this is going nowhere good. And the United States and the Western powers either did not take Vladimir Putin seriously, did not consider Russia post-1991 a country worth trifling about, and now we're here. Now Russia has invaded Ukraine. They're dismantling it. They're going to win that war. Spoiler alert on that one. And now you've got crazy talk coming out of Finland and Sweden that they want to be fast-tracked into NATO. That's going to move the border of NATO up against Russia. And coincidentally, Helsinki, Finland, I believe is not even 100 miles from St. Petersburg, Russia. So now you have a NATO partner, or potential NATO partner, who is going to be able to bring in NATO weaponry and park it basically the same distance as Washington, D.C. is from Baltimore, Maryland. That's crazy. Or Philadelphia and D.C., whatever. But it's well within the range of modern ballistic nuclear missiles. So NATO and Finland, or Finland and Sweden talking about joining NATO is lunacy. And I might do a video on that as well, because that will get us into World War III. I believe if Finland and Sweden decide to join NATO, and if NATO is stupid enough to admit them, Russia, with its now battle-hardened army that has taken Ukraine, will redirect all of its energy, and they will invade Finland and maybe Sweden, and they will steamroll those countries, unless the rest of NATO, and especially the US, comes to their aid. And then it's game on, and then it's World War III, and then who the hell knows? I probably won't have a YouTube channel at that point, because I'll be downstairs in the basement with my stored dry foods, because that's what's going to happen. But anyway, this was a longer one, and I really appreciate you guys hanging in there. If you're still there, I got cotton mouth right now reading Putin's speech, but reading his speech from February, The Empire of Lies, and going back to 2007, you can see the difference between the two speeches. First, in 2007, he was like, hey, Russia's trying to be reasonable. We need you to meet us in the middle. We think this is fair. Empire of Lies speech, we're going into Ukraine. We're going to kick ass. You guys have lied to us. You're no good. Get the F out of our way. That's basically what Putin said in the Empire of Lies speech. I mean, it was cold and then hot. And this is not going to cool down the longer NATO, and especially the United States, interferes with Russia's military operation war in Ukraine. The Ukrainian people are going to suffer from it the longer the United States keeps meddling in it, and it's going to antagonize Russia further, because we did not take them seriously. We did not deal with Putin back in 2007, because we were making the world safe from terror. We were fighting the global war on terror. 20 years later, that part of the world's an absolute mess. The guys we went to go fight are now in charge of that country, and now Russia's invading Ukraine, and now we have a first world military invading a country that we're feeding weapons and possibly trained personnel into. This is crazy, but this is where we are. So anyway, I appreciate you tuning in. Vladimir Putin, the 2007 speech, he was telling us what they were planning on. He was being, from what I gather, pretty reasonable about it, but we just didn't think he was worth the time of day. And now it's 2022, and everybody's paying attention now. Okay, cool. Thanks for watching. Appreciate you. If you're still here, you are troopers for hanging in there for that whole speech. But I hope you got something out of it. Probably kick out another video, maybe on the same topic. As I said, Sweden and Finland getting into this mess is just ridiculous. They're going to get their clocks clean if they do, but we'll see what happens. Anyway, everybody stay safe out there. Hope you're weathering the storm here with inflation and supply shortages, but I don't see it stopping anytime soon. Okay, so until next time, take it easy, and we'll see you then.